It's time to practice what we learned. Because thus far, over the last modules, we learned a lot about React. We learned a lot about the core features that make up React, and you actually already have enough knowledge to start building your first simple React projects. To specifically practice these super important core concepts we covered thus far, I got a dedicated project for which I want to go with you, which is relatively simple, but which picks up all these core things you gotta know. We're going to build this relatively simple, yet not too simple application here. It's an application where you can add fictional users like Max, you can enter an age, and add a user. Now you won't be able to edit or delete the user, but we got a couple of other nice features which we haven't built thus far, but which we actually will be able to build. For example, if I have my empty inputs here and I click on add user, you see I get this warning dialog, this warning overlay here, which we can dismiss by clicking on OK or by clicking on the backdrop. You will also see that if I enter, let's say, a negative age here, I get a different error message. So we got a little bit of a more complex validation, and we of course got this modal component, this overlay here, which is something you know from a lot of web pages as well. Last but not least, if you add a user successfully, we also reset these inputs here. So that also works. So whilst it's certainly not the most complex application of the world, it is a great project for practicing what we learned thus far. You can absolutely skip this module if you're not interested in that and you just want to continue to the next concepts, to the next things you need to learn about React. But I would recommend that you go through this module to make sure you really understand all those core concepts we worked on over the last modules. And I actually encourage you to go ahead and try this on your own first. You of course don't have to get the exact styling right. Instead, it is about building these React components and adding the general logic I showed you over the last minutes. Of course, this will be challenging, but you will only need concepts and features you learned about. So you can build this, but again, it definitely will be challenging. Nonetheless, definitely give this a try on your own first, but of course thereafter have a look at my course lectures in this section where I show you my approach and my solution, which you can then use to compare your solution. Attached you find a simple starting project, basically a pretty empty React application with an empty app component. And once you downloaded and extracted the attached file, you just need to run npm install to install all dependencies, like the React library. And thereafter, once you ran npm install, which I already did here, you run npm start to start this application. And you'll be greeted by such an empty screen because currently there's nothing inside of app.js, nothing inside of our app component. Now, in the application which you saw in the last lecture, I want to have a couple of different areas, a couple of different components. We had that component where we could enter our name and our age. We had that error modal, that error overlay component. We had a button to submit this and to confirm that we saw the error in that error modal. And we of course also had that list of users. Therefore, I'll start by roughly planning out the components we'll have. And for that, I'll add a new components folder in which I want to store those components. And I'll add a UI folder for general UI components, which we'll have, like the button. And in components, I'll also add a second folder, and that will be my users folder for all the user-related components. And now in there, we can start adding component files, and I'll start with that component that allows us to add a new user. Hence here in the users folder, I'll add a new add user.js file, which should hold the logic for us to add a new user. Now in there, I want to have a React component. So of course we have to import React from React as you learned, because we're going to use some JSX code here. I'll then add my add user component using this function syntax, which we can use in JavaScript, an arrow function stored in a constant. Of course, as I mentioned before, You can also add a function like this. Nothing wrong with that, but I'll go for this approach. And I'll export this as my default so that we can import that component, that function, into another file and use it there. Now, inside of add user, I in the end wanna render something on the screen which allows the user to enter a name and an age and have a button to confirm all of that. Therefore, in here, I will add a form, let's say, and inside of that form, I wanna have a label where I say username, and of course, that should all be returned. So let's wrap it into brackets and then put a return statement in front of it. So there I want to have a label and I want to have an input where the user then is actually able to type that username. And that input will be of type text because I, well, expect some text there. Now for accessibility, we can also add an ID here, username. And then on the label, we would add the for attribute normally. Now, for, just like class, is not a name that is available in JSX because these would be reserved JavaScript names. And therefore, it's HTML for, actually. That's the prop name for assigning that for attribute to a label. And with that, we connect it to that input. And that's important for screen readers and so on, so that they understand which label belongs to which input. So we got that. Now I also need another pair of label and input for the age in years, let's say. And here the type will be number because I expect to get a number here. Something like 31, 18, 25, and so on. Now I'll name this age, I'll give it an ID of age, and therefore the HTML4 prop here also has a value of age. And with that I got these two inputs. Now below those, I want to have a button of type submit, which will basically submit that form. And here I have add user as my text. So that's a straightforward form. Now on the form here, I'll add the onSubmit prop to specify a function that should be executed when that form is submitted. And therefore here, I will actually add a new function inside of the add user component function. And that's the, let's say, add user handler function. Now here I expect to get my event object, and I will call event prevent default to prevent that default, which for the submission event is that a request is sent. I don't want that default, hence I prevent it here. And now we can connect onSubmit here to add user handler by passing add user handler like this to onSubmit. Important, as I explained before, don't add parentheses here. This would immediately execute add user handler when this line is parsed. Instead, I just want to pass a pointer to that function to the onSubmit prop so that the form component internally can use that function when it needs to use it, i.e. when that form is getting submitted. So with that, we got this add user handler here. Now let's go over to app.js and let's import it here. So I import add user from ./components/users/add user. And here in the div, we can then add user like that. That's how we can add this component here. And if we now save that and go back, we should see this relatively ugly but working component. I can click add user and the page is not reloading, which proves that this form submission is effectively handled and the default is prevented. So that's the start. Now, some styling would be nice because that doesn't really look the way I want it to look. Now I'll start in index CSS. There you got some basic styling. I'll go to the HTML element here and add a background styling of 1F, 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 like this, and this will give us a nice dark grayish background. Now I also want to wrap this username and age into a card, you could say, into a container with rounded corners and with a white background. And that's therefore something we'll build in the next lecture. Of course, feel free to try this on your own, build such a wrapping container, maybe already with the right styles on your own, and in the next lecture, we'll build it together. So let's build this card component, which I want to have around my form together. So here in add user, I want to be able to wrap this in a card component, which doesn't exist yet, like this. And that should apply a nice styling here to this form. For that, I'll go to the UI folder and in there add a card.js file. Now in there, I'll create a pretty much standard React component. So we import React from React. We then have card here, which gets props, and we export this as our component. Now, the card component can be fairly trivial. I want to return a div, let's say, and inside of that div, I want to output the content which this card component is wrapped around. So when I wrap card around my form here, this form should of course be output inside of the card. So the card component here should output what's passed between the opening and closing tags of card. And you learned that you can access this content on the special children prop, like this. You put that between curly braces because it's not JSX code, it's a JavaScript expression that should be evaluated inside of the JSX code. And props children will give us that content which is passed between the opening and closing tag of the card component. Now, I will also assign a class here so that we can style it. And now I want to use CSS modules here. You don't need to use that. You could use styled components. You could use regular CSS classes and make sure that you don't repeat class names. But I will use CSS modules. And therefore, I'll add a card.module.css file here where I can specify my card styles. I will add a card class in there, just like this, a normal CSS class, and give it a background of white. Whoops, that should be background. Give it a box shadow of 0, 2 pixels, 8 pixels, RGBA 0000.26, which will add a little bit of a drop shadow to the card, and a border radius of 10 pixels here for rounded corners. Now in card.js, we can import this. Here we can import /card.module.css. And you learn that for CSS modules, you now have to alter this import a little bit. This import would be right if you have a non-module file, if you used regular CSS. But if you want to use that CSS modules feature, you have to import something, for example, classes, from that file. And now here on class name, we can assign one of the classes we have inside of the CSS file. In this case, we of course have only one class, that's the card class. So we can just access classes.card here. And this will assign this generated unique class name to that div. And with that, the only step that is left to have that finished card and to use it is to go to the add user component where I want to use that card and import it here. Because you always need to import what you want to use. If you have a component in a different file and you want to use it in this file, you have to import it from that other file. Otherwise, JavaScript and this React build process here can't make a connection between this file and the file in which your component is defined. So here we can therefore import card from ... to go up one level, so to go out of that users folder into the components folder, and then into UI, and then to card. And you omit the file extension here for JavaScript files. With that, we're importing card, and if we now saved it, it should compile fine. And this looks a little bit nicer, but of course it's still not the final look I want. Now, to get that nicer look, attached you find a CSS file. To be precise, you find the adduser.module.css file. And you can simply drag and drop that, so download it and then drag and drop it into your users folder next to the add user component. This file includes a couple of styles which will help us make this look nicer. Now to use this file, we have to go to add users, to the add user component. And besides importing the card here, we can now also import classes from that newly added CSS file, so from the adduser.module.css file. For non-JavaScript files, you need to add that file extension here. And now to apply that, I want to go to my card and actually add the class name property here. and add classes.input. The input class is defined here in the CSS file, and with that we can add it. But now there's one important thing to note. Of course, here card is our custom component. It's not one of those built-in HTML components. And therefore, since it's our own component, it only has the props, or it only is able to work with the props we use inside of that component. Now, these default HTML components like form, label, input, divs, and so on, they are all pre-configured by React to, for example, work with the class name prop and to then apply a fitting CSS class to the underlying rendered HTML node. Now, for our own component, it of course does not know what to do with the class name prop because it's just our own component, not a built-in HTML component. So we have to go to our own component and make sure that we accept an incoming class name prop and that we do something with it. Now, what do we want to do? In the end, I want to make sure that the CSS class we're applying to the div with the help of class name on that div, that the classes applied to the div reflect both the card class, which we already are applying, as well as any potentially incoming classes on the class name prop of this card component. So that any class I add here on the card component when I use it is in the end applied together with the card class to the div which is rendered by the card. So I want to apply two CSS classes, one coming from the card module CSS file and one coming from outside, from the props, potentially coming via props. And we can easily make this work. We can add a template literal here as a value for class name on the div, and then inject something dynamically with this $ curly brace syntax and add classes.card. That is what we added before as well. But now I'll inject a second value, and that's props.className. Now it's your component, so you could use any property name here. It doesn't have to be class name here on your own props object. I'm just using class name here as well, so that we're able to use our own component just as we work with regular HTML components. I can now set class name on my own component as well, because I'm accepting and using the class name prop here inside of the component. If we would have chosen a different name here, like CSS class, for example, we would need to use that CSS class name here as well when we use the card component. But again, I want to have one API, one way of assigning CSS classes, and therefore I will use class name because that's also what React uses for its built-in HTML components. And with that, we're merging an external class with our internally defined class here. And if I now save this now looks much nicer thanks to the styles set up in the add user component. And with that, this looks not too bad. Now let's make sure we also have a nice looking button. And for that, you actually find a file attached to the next lecture, the button.module.css file, and you can use this to try and build your own button. Otherwise, we'll build and use that button together in the next lecture. So, time for a button. Just like a card, a button is a default UI element which we're going to use in different parts of the application. Therefore, here I'll add a button.js file, and I already mentioned it, attached you find a button.module.css file, which I'll again download and drag and drop into that UI folder next to the button.js file. Now, inside of the button.js file, we can import React from React because we're going to write some JSX code. We can import classes from /button.module.css already. And we can then define our button constant, which is our functional component, and export this as a default. And now in here, I simply want to return the built-in button component, but of course with my default styling applied and with some configuration options. To start with the styling, I'll add class name and point at classes.button. Because in the button.module.css file you'll find that button class, so we can use it thanks to CSS modules to apply a little styling here. I also want to make sure that the type of the button can be set, and I want to make sure it can be set from outside, so from the place where we use our custom button component. Therefore, the value assigned to the type prop on the built-in button component will be dynamic, and I will simply access props.type here, but also provide a fallback in case that should not be set with the OR operator. The alternative is button. So if props type is undefined, this button value will be used as a fallback type for the built-in button. Now, in addition, I'll add onClick, and here I expect to get a handler function via props on my own button component, so I'll simply forward this to props onClick. Now that name here is totally up to you. You don't have to name it onClick, but again, I want to make my own button basically usable like the built-in button, and therefore I use the same naming. So I will have an onClick prop on my button component, and any function received there is just passed on to the built-in button component through its onClick prop. And last but not least here, I also want to be able to output some content between the button tags, and I expect to get that content between the tags of my own button, and therefore we use the special children prop here. That should be all. Now we can go to add user, where we have a button, and use our own custom button. And hopefully I can now just replace built-in button, which is lowercase, with my custom button, which starts with a capital B, per the convention that your component should always start with capital characters. And we now just need to import it, because as I mentioned, you need to import all things you want to use from other files. So here I'll import button from going up one level, UI, button, like this. And if we now save that, we got this nicer looking button which should work just like the built-in button, because in the end it just wraps the built-in button, of course. But that's the idea behind all React components. In the end, you always compose them all from the built-in HTML components, but you structure them in a certain way and maybe attach certain logic so that you have your own components. And with that, that looks quite well. Now let's make sure we actually fetch user input, and we then kind of start rendering a list of users below that input form here. Let's continue with this app, and let's make sure we actually fetch user input so that we can then, in the next step, also render it as part of a list of users. We got our add user component here with the add user handler, which is triggered when the form is submitted. And now the goal is to collect the two entered values, the username and the age, and utilize them here. Now to collect the values, we can use a technique we already learned about in the last modules. We can use state management in React to update the state with every keystroke and hence save what the user enters in such a state variable, which is then managed by React. For that, we need to import the useState hook here inside of the add user component, and then we need to initialize it. For that, we call useState, and we can define the default, the initial starting state. And since I want to manage one piece of state for every input, the starting state will basically be no input, so an empty string. And then I have my entered username here, and my state updating function set entered username. Now, in case you're not sure what this syntax means, make sure you go through the respective lectures in the basics module. This is a JavaScript syntax which is called array destructuring, and we use it because useState always returns an array with exactly two elements. And with this syntax, we're pulling these elements out of that returned array, and we store them in separate constants of the name entered username and set entered username. And I chose those names for those constants because the first element of that returned array is the current state snapshot, and every time this component re-renders, which it, for example, does when the state is updated, this constant will hold the latest state snapshot. And set entered username, on the other hand, holds a function which we can call to change that state and to then trigger such a re-render cycle. So now we need a function which is triggered on every keystroke of that input here. And for that, I'll have my username change handler function, for example, where I get the event object, because we'll listen to a default DOM event, and such events will dispatch objects with more information. And we can bind this toInput here through the onChange prop, which then will tie this to the change event listener. So here I pass my username change handler, and therefore this function will be triggered for every keystroke in the input element down there. And now here I will call setEnteredUsername, and I want to set it to what the user currently entered, and we can get that entered value with the help of that event object. Because there we can access the target of the event, which is the input, and then the value property of that input to get the currently entered value. Now I'll just copy that and repeat that to also have a age change handler where I call setEnteredAge, because that's the second piece of state I now want to manage. Hence I'll duplicate this as well. And here I have my entered age and setEnteredAge. And with that, we're updating the entered age on every keystroke. We of course also need to make the connection down there. So age change handler. And now we got both the username and the age stored. Now in add user handler, we can therefore now console log entered username and entered age. And entered age. Like this. And if we now save everything, we can go back, open up the developer tools here and go to the JavaScript console and maybe enter max here and 31. And if I click add user, you see that output here. Now at the moment, we can also submit an empty form, like an empty age field, but that's something we'll fix later. Generally, fetching that data works. Now as a next step, let's make sure that when we click add user, we actually reset these inputs so that both input fields are empty again. And let's make sure we also have some basic validation, which simply makes sure that nothing happens, that we don't print this information here if one of the two input fields is empty or if the age is smaller than 1, or if it's equal to 0 or smaller than 0. So that's something you can try on your own next. We'll do it together in the next lecture, of course. Let's implement that resetting and validation logic together. And let's start with resetting. Resetting generally is easy. Here in add user handler, I just want to call setEnteredUsername and set this again to an empty string, and do the same also for setEnteredAge. Now with that, I reset my states to an empty string once I logged the state snapshot here. Now, what you'll see, however, is that if I save this and I enter max and 31, we get the output here, but the inputs are actually not cleared. So setting our state snapshots to empty strings doesn't seem to work here, right? Well, it actually does work, but one problem we have is that we don't reflect our current state in the input. That's not a problem as long as we don't want to change it from anywhere else than user keystrokes, but here I want to change it when the form is submitted. So I want to feed the current state for entered username and entered age back into those inputs. And we can easily do that. These input elements have value props, and we can set them to values which will then be reflected in the inputs. And I can set my value of that first input to entered username, and the value of the second input here to entered age. And now I'll reformat that, and with that we'll have inputs which actually reflect the current state snapshot, even if it's not changed through a keystroke, but like here, upon a form submission. So if we now save that and try again, you'll see that now it's cleared. So that's step 1. Now for the validation. For the validation here in add user handler, I want to make sure that all this code here only executes if we have valid inputs. So if neither the name nor the age is empty, and the age is also not smaller than 1. For that we can add a if check here, and check if entered username trimmed is actually empty, which we can check by checking its length. Trim will remove any excess white space, and if it then has a length of 0, we know there is no character in that string, it's an empty string. And if that's the case, or if entered age is empty. So if we have the same check here, then I want to return. For now, I'll not do anything else. If I return here, here, then this code is not going to execute because return statements finish the function execution. Now I also want to check for my age input value, not just if it's empty, but also if it's not empty, if it's maybe smaller than 1. So I'll have another condition here, another if check, where I check if entered age is smaller than 1. And if that's the case, I also want to return. Now here's one important thing to keep in mind. Entered age is actually a string, not a number. We initialize it to a string here, and anything that's entered into an input is always retrieved as a string. That's just how JavaScript and the DOM and so on works. So we have a string here. Entered age is a string, not a number. Now I'm comparing it to a number here, and generally that should work in JavaScript, but to be super safe, we can force a conversion of entered age to a number by adding a plus here. And with that we ensure that, well, it is a number. With that, if I now save this, you will see that if I click add user, we now got no log here on the right. If I enter max 31 on the other hand, we do get a log. If I enter max and the age is empty, I get no log. And if I enter a negative age, let's say, I also get no log. So our validation, our basic validation here seems to work. Now we'll take care about the error modal later. For now, let's make sure that for the cases where we do get valid inputs, we actually take those inputs and we store the different users in a list, which we then render below the input field. Now again, you can try this on your own. Otherwise, we'll build this together over the next lectures.